Welcome to the Universal Dancer podcast with your host Leslie Zare, author of The Alchemy of Dance and the Alchemia Remedies. Coming to you from Cairo, Egypt, the ancient land of Kem. Journey with us to explore sacred dance, the sacred arts, the mystical and the magical. Join a community of like-minded souls seeking to understand the cosmic dance of co-creation through the sacred arts. Come along and expand your mind, ignite your creativity, and explore something new and something old. Welcome to the Universal Dancer podcast. I'm Leslie Zare, your host for the podcast, and I have another very interesting guest for you today. So let's just jump right in, and I will introduce you to her. Karen Kinney is an award-winning author, internationally exhibited artist, and speaker. She has studied contemplative spirituality for over 20 years and taught about creative freedom and inner transformation at the University of Hong Kong, Cambridge University, and San Miguel de Allende Writers' Conference in Mexico. She speaks internationally about the divine feminine and the innate connection between spirituality and creativity. She authors a quarterly newsletter that explores spirituality and transformation from a feminist perspective, and is writing a new book that explores this topic in depth. Her most recent book, award-winning Doorways to Transformation, Everyday Wisdom for the Creative Soul, is a manual for everyday spiritual and creative growth. Her first book, The Reluctant Artist, Navigating and Sustaining a Creative Path, is a guide to fully owning and nurturing your creative work and has been taught at UCLA and the University of Hong Kong. She has pursued a multifaceted art career, and her works reside in numerous private collections, including those of Stanford University, actor Bob Odenkirk, and NPR's Guy Raz. She has designed installation work for the Los Angeles International Airport and painted murals in Los Angeles and Mexico. Karen obtained a master's degree in social work from the University of Chicago and is currently based in Mexico City. Let's welcome Karen to the show. Welcome,
you.
Karen. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Leslie. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm very excited to get into this conversation because I think for me, it touches on so many important points. So as I always begin, I like to kind of see how you got into what you're doing. So at what point did you realize that you were an artist, or would you say that your journey began as an artist?
Yeah, I think from a very early age, I was a very creative child. So that just came naturally to me. So I think I had early awareness, and, I was always making things as a kid and doing craft projects and also music. That was a very important piece for me. And so I played the piano from really starting at a young age, all through high school. And so the arts in general were what I was drawn to as a kid. And so I think that I did know early on that that's who I was, although that's different from then having permission to actually embrace that and pursue that in my adulthood. So that came later, that evolution. But knowing as a child that I was creative, it was very kind of innate to just what I desired and enjoyed pursuing.
I think it's wonderful if parents let you do that, because I think children are innately creative, but sadly, I think in educational systems, that seems to be something that's not focused on, or as you said, it's okay to do that when you're a child.
Yes.
But then as you grow up,
Exactly.
I had a similar, my mother's an actress, and so I pretty much grew up in the theater, and you are kind of an outcast. You're kind of on the fringe because other people don't do that, and then it's, well, okay, but what are you going to do, when you grow up, kind of a thing. And so I think it's hard. I think it's hard to
Mhm.
embrace being an artist as you move into the adult world.
Yeah, very much so. And, I didn't grow up in a family where anyone else, well, my brother actually is a very excellent writer. So he was creative in that way. But my parents weren't really pursuing creativity for themselves. And also I grew up in the Midwest, which is a very structured, kind of linear, programmed part of the United States, conventional. And so again, that, and then as you mentioned, the educational system, there were a lot of cultural forces around me that even if I'd, you know, uh, had the wherewithal as a child to know I'm going to pursue this, the cultural forces really didn't support a life of creativity. Yeah.
So where did you start? I mean, did you study art at university, or because I see that your master's degree is in social work. So
Hmm.
what kind of how what was your path through moving through that?
Yeah. So yes, no, I did not study art or anything creative in school. Although looking back now, I wish I had. Right, if I had been in my most authentic self, I would, and all the stars aligned, I would have done that. Probably would have studied music actually. But no, I did study psychology in my undergraduate, and then I got a degree in social work, and that was a very short-lived career for me. It was a misguided career. It came out of other compulsions or feeling like this is who I'm supposed to be, or it came with a somewhat lack of awareness of self at that point. But it was also pragmatic. I mean, that is a side to the arts that's can be challenging. So I didn't really rediscover and then embrace my creative side till later. Well, later, it really wasn't that late, but in my 30s, I guess that's still somewhat young. But it wasn't like at 18. So that came later, that whole, I had to deprogram a lot of things and then open myself up to new things and new paradigms in order for that to happen. Yeah.
But I think too, the path that we walk then
Hmm.
creates a map for other people. And it sounds like that's what you did with the books that you've written. I
Hmm.
think probably having a background in psychology was really
Hmm.
helpful, at least to help other people to move through the process. So what did you do? Did you
Hmm.
just decide in your 30s like this is it? I'm an artist. I'm never mind the rest of this, or what? How did
Uh-huh.
this happen?
Yeah, I'd say it was quite gradual. So, it began with moving to California, as many things do for many people, right? Exiting to the West Coast in some form. And so that was very instrumental in terms of just shaking up my, my worldview. I'm in a completely different culture. I initially was in Northern California, but then the bulk of my time was spent in Southern California. Excuse me, which is very much full of creative people coming to pursue dreams in Southern California. And I think, a series of events kind of led to my decision to embrace being an artist. One was being laid off from a nonprofit job. That was certainly an impetus for, okay, what do I want to do? Do I want to just go back to the same old, a similar job elsewhere? So that really kicked off the no, I think I'm meant to be creative. I knew that. But then it was like, well, what kind of creativity I could do? There are a million different things one can do as a creative person. So it began a real intentional season of exploration in my life. I tried all kinds of things, and I did all kinds of odd part-time jobs for people. I was an assistant to a decorative painter who did like murals in people's homes. I was worked in a theater for an internship doing like set design. I helped in the prop department. I worked in a store that was like an interior design based store, but they also sold paint. And so I learned a lot there about colors and mixing colors. I worked for a couple that made their own line of greeting cards. They needed people to help produce the cards. I mean, I did, you name it. I kind of did the job, but that was all part of my process of seeing like, okay, what kind of creativity am I wired to put into the world? And it eventually culminated with me feeling like, oh, I'd really like to make my own art as opposed to producing other people's projects or being their assistant. And so that's what led initially when I moved to LA to this whole becoming a fine artist, which I spent about 12 years doing. But so it was quite gradual and very unfolding, which I think is the feminine way. But Yes. And I do like what you said. I do feel that books I've written, in a way, I feel like they're hopefully guides for maybe other people who are on a path that has parallels, and maybe they can glean something that can help with, oh, look, here's what happened for this person. Maybe that can help me in my life. So,
Well, I haven't finished, but I've read your book, Doorways to Transformation. I want to come back to that, but I didn't
yeah.
know that you'd written The Reluctant Artist,
hmm
Navigating and Sustaining a Creative Path. So I'd kind
Yeah.
of like to dive into that because
Sure.
as
Sure.
as an artist, I am not sure I'm really sustaining that path, but I'm
uh-huh.
trying. So
Uh-huh.
yeah, maybe you can tell us a little bit about that book. That's also the book
Mm.
that's being taught at universities,
Mm.
right? Or it's being used
Yes,
in
it has. It
universities.
has been. Yes, I don't know if it currently is today, but it was at one point. There were some classes where it was used in the class, and yeah. Well, that book was written while I was living in LA, and it was really a summary of my experience and thoughts on creativity, but from the vantage point of being an artist in Los Angeles, so in that particular milieu. And really, my goal with the book is to encourage people with their creativity, to value it. I think that's a really key point, is getting to a place in your life where you can give inner validation to your work as a creative person, because external validation comes and goes. It's certainly not a constant, so you really need something stronger. I would say a strong internal compass that helps propel you forward, because being creative over the long haul, like, isn't easy. There's periods where you're maybe feel burned out or not inspired, and then other periods where it's more active, but it's very cyclical, I think. And so you need some kind of internal life force that holds the vision for your creativity, even when it's not being outwardly active in the world in a visible way. Yeah. And so I really do hope that people, when they read that book in particular, feel encouraged, and that they can value their creativity, because often, as we mentioned earlier, the culture does not provide that. So
Well, so you're very much wrapped up with the divine feminine and feminine wisdom. So how do you feel that the divine feminine plays into this? Where is
mm.
her role in this growth and transformation?
Yeah, I think she's all over the creative process, or she's very inherent to it. And I think that's something that awareness has unfolded in my life over time. I don't think when I became an artist initially that I had some awareness of the divine feminine, but I wasn't as steeped in her as I am now. But now when I look back, I think, wow, the creative process for me, and I think it can be for all of us, is such a portal to the divine feminine, because it so illustrates so many qualities of co-creating with spirit, and being open to receiving prompts, and interdependence with one another through collaboration, and some of these, maybe I would say, more organic, synchronistic qualities that I think are parallels to the divine feminine and her energy in the world. For me, they've always been such an integral part of the creative process. But I think early on for me, when I was entering into that, it was just a new learning curve, because it really required a new way of showing up in the world, a new way of being, like a new way of listening, that I think are all parallel to the divine feminine. But that was all new to me, because it was very different from the linear, programmed, kind of box-like structure of my upbringing. So it's really kind
Well,
of, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think the feminine is about creativity. I think of that poem, that Rumi poem, she is creator.
Yeah.
And I think just the fact that we have a womb, which
Yes.
is creative center, like that's our center of gravity actually in a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it does lend itself to that creative process. We know it from a very deep space, I guess. Whether you're
Mm-hmm.
creating a child or creating an art project, I think you
Mm-hmm.
have it inside your body. So
Mm-hmm.
I do think and as the divine feminine comes more to prominence or acceptance or rises, or however you want to put that, I
Mm-hmm.
think the whole concept of creativity becomes more embraced. Because as we were saying, like, okay, from our childhood, we knew that we were creatives, but society didn't really accept that. Well, I think that is partly because it was a patriarchal structure, and it was based on, doing your work. It's not based on being creative. It's based on supporting somebody else's idea and then, going into a company or whatever it is. So I do think that as she rises, all the concepts associated with her, like creativity, are going to begin, even if it's not something that you want to do as a job, even if it's not your career. I do think that creativity as self-care has become more prominent. Like, take an art class, those, drink wine and paint a picture parties or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
inspiring some kind of creativity. So I do think that it's somehow more embraced or on the rise, or people think it's important now, where maybe they didn't think it was important before.
Yeah, I think very much so. It's almost becoming like a new currency, if you will, in terms of it. Yeah, to speak in capitalistic terms. Yes, I think those qualities are much more valued now than, even when I was growing up. And obviously it depends where you are in the world too, or if you're in the US, what region of the country. That's something that was really instrumental for me about living in LA. It was like this nurturing womb space for both the Divine Mother and creativity. And so just in the culture there. And so that was a perfect place for me to be this kind of infant creative coming into finding my voice, really, and also encountering the divine feminine along with it.
I also think you made a point about interdependence. And I think, which I also think is an aspect of the divine feminine, that concept of community, as opposed to stepping out on your own and being individualistic. Although you may create alone, I do think that, as you said, being in a community of creatives or just around, you said you'd gone to the West Coast, or people go to the East Coast, they go to New York City. And I think that it's a similar thing, that you're going to find other people, other like-minded people, or more acceptance, or people you could work with, or whatever it is. So what are your thoughts about interdependence?
Yeah, well, I very much agree. I think it's such a key part of the divine feminine, and it's so countercultural, counter US culture. I'll say that, where we're, pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality, right? So, I think creativity was the beginning of kind of deepening interdependence in my life, but that didn't really shift in more dramatic and fundamental ways until I moved to Mexico, which is maybe another topic. But I'll begin just with the creative process in Los Angeles. I think some of my most meaningful experiences of being connected to others through my creativity was through some of the public art projects I did. I did a couple mural projects in Los Angeles where, you're standing on a street corner. So that invites people to come up and talk to you, which they did. And I really, of all the art projects I did over 12 years, that was my favorite because it was highest in engagement with other people. And you're creating something that's for the community. It's not just your creation. It's meant to, really initiate dialogue with people passing by. And so those experiences of the public art were really impactful. And then, like I said, for over the past 6 years, I've been living in Mexico. So that took this whole experience of interdependence to a whole nother level, because now I've been transplanted into a culture that's much higher on the scale of valuing interdependence, valuing relationships. That's a very, probably ranks very high on the hierarchy of what's important. So I don't know if you want to delve into that a little bit more, or.
Yes. I mean, talk about your experiences in Mexico, because I think that that's really important. And Carolyn always says the greatest spiritual lesson is to leave your tribe, and because you go somewhere where none of the rules apply, and you have to reassess what's you and what's the culture that you were raised in. So how has that impacted your process?
Yeah, I think it's been really phenomenal, like in the best way, because I've always been a highly relational person. So now I'm in this culture that, kind of mirrors back how I've always felt and wanted to be, but I think struggled to be to some degree in the US because of the hyper individualism and the hyper emphasis on do everything yourself, and now I'd say my experience in Mexico has been so opposite in those respects, in the sense that everyone is very interconnected here. It's a very service oriented culture. So yet people help you. I'm like, wow, people are helping me. I'm just not used to that. I'm used to like do everything myself. If something's too heavy, we'll just like schlep it to your car the best you can, that kind of thing. And here it's still a learning, something I need to remember regularly to learn how to receive help, because I'm just not programmed that way. But I really have welcomed the opportunity to be in a culture where I can practice that. I can ask for help because people want to help you. And like I said, even just the whole emphasis on relationships goes to another level here. So, in the US, the emphasis is on efficiency. So for example, you might email someone or text them. You certainly don't call anyone anymore. You don't want to take their time, and certainly you don't meet face to face unless it's, it's all about saving time. But here, it's almost the opposite. A friend of mine here was actually talking to a Mexican company actually about employment, a job. And it was just an informal, there had been an email about it, but then the person who was looking at maybe hiring her said, oh, look, very much insisted that we need to meet for coffee and face to face. This is even before having a formal interview. Like it would have been rude to continue the exploration around the job via email or via a digital form. It was like, no, we have to meet face to face. Like that was the value. And I thought, oh, how refreshing. But it takes more time, because relationships take time. But I think that's allowed in this culture and in many others around the world, because the whole concept of time is also something that's quite different. It's not about speed and all that. So anyway, it's for me.
I can relate to that. Egypt is very much in its own time loop.
Yeah. But I think it's awakened pieces of my soul in new ways that have been so life-giving. And I feel like it's led to a more maybe embodied experience of the divine feminine for me, where I'm experiencing kind of these just feminine aspects of nurture and relationships and kindness to others and things that reflect a different way of moving in the world. But it's based on different values, really.
Absolutely. So in your intro, you talked about sort of the feminist approach to the divine feminine. Can you talk about that a little bit? What do you feel is the feminist approach to the divine feminine?
I think when I think about feminist, I think more of a feminist approach to spirituality. I might say that, as opposed to the divine feminine. For me, okay. I sometimes use those words not completely interchangeably. I think of the word feminist when I think of spirituality only in the sense of countering patriarchal forms of religion and spirituality. So not feminist in the sense that sometimes I feel like it's been used in the US culture to essentially mean becoming more masculine. So that's not what I'm referring to.
That's why I was curious. You put those two things together, right. I'm like, okay, well, what do you mean?
Yes, that's a good question. So I think when I think of the word feminist in regards to spirituality or spiritual path, I think of it mostly to be distinctly different from a patriarchal approach. But it's interesting even just talking about this now, because I'm like, oh, that's interesting to think about how words have been used and how they've been perceived. And that's why I do like the word feminine as well, because I think it doesn't carry some of the baggage that the word feminist can have baggage for a lot of people. So so thank you. Actually, now that we're talking about this, that's an interesting thing to think about, just in terms of how you communicate these new ways of being and language. That's always as a writer for me, I'm always, of course, thinking about language and words and how do people hear them or not hear them. So
Yeah, I think we need a new word like femininist or
Yes,
something
yes,
that because
yeah,
yeah, I don't think the feminist revolution was about exalting feminine values
right,
like creativity
right.
as much as it was about equal pay or
Yes.
controlling your own life or whatever.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
yeah, I think we maybe do need new language or something because yeah, it's those words are charged, I think, for a lot of people. So it's hard to, for
Mhm.
myself included.
Yeah,
That's
it
why I
is.
asked the
It
question.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I also think even the word feminine, like that can start to carry certain, especially in
Yes.
a world where things are less binary, that people can sometimes confuse that with um, being a more rigid word than how I experience it. You know, I experience word feminine as relating to energies and something that all humans embody, you know,
Yeah.
feminine and masculine, that kind of thing. And I think so, yeah, it's an interesting landscape we're living in
Yes.
terms of how to communicate. Mm-hmm.
It is. And I think, I mean, I think it's an exciting time because things are changing. I remember when I first started doing work like with women's groups, which was probably, well, it was more than 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in Egypt. So still the culture is different. But then I would go like to the US and I would teach. And I really wasn't allowed to say things about, for example, having children. Like that was a really charged, if I would mention something about women and having children, well, women can do other things besides having children. They were still in that like, we're not just here to have babies thing. And
Yeah.
that's not what I meant, but I couldn't even open the subject.
Mm-hmm.
Now there are lots of people that are doing work around the mother archetype, around,
Mm-hmm.
and about having children. And so I think it really has changed. There's less resistance or something. I don't know what it is, but I'm happy that it's changed and we can be more embracing of all the different, you know, different groups or different nuances and talk more about
Mm-hmm.
the feminine approach, the yin approach, whatever you want to call it, than
Mm-hmm.
it being about specific roles that
Right.
people would play.
Yeah, no, I think I've noticed that as well. And I, I think it encourages me because it says to me, it's an indicator that perhaps the feminine is finally coming to a place of really being valued, right? As
Yes.
opposed to we must obliterate it or we must now, as women, just don completely a masculine approach to life and traits. Well, that's also just internalized misogyny. So I think, oh, I long for a globe where the true feminine is really valued. Like this is as a high value and it can pair beautifully with the divine masculine. And that's the vision to me of a more healed and balanced world. So I think some of those things just shifts you've seen to me do feel encouraging that these other ways of being that are innate to feminine wisdom will finally be recognized as the places of value that they are. Mm-hmm.
Well, and just the whole idea of community and support. Like in the
Mm-hmm.
past, I couldn't even open the subject. So
Mm-hmm.
how is that like holding space for someone if you can't, about
Yeah.
communicating and about listening?
Yeah.
People need to be able to speak. You
Mm-hmm.
don't have to agree with them, but I do think that the
Yeah.
feminine way also is about communication and about entertaining other ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Again, you don't have to agree with me, but at
Right.
least let me say something instead of this whole shutting people down and cancel culture and all of that. I think is
Right.
just like a backlash
Mm-hmm.
to to not conforming or something. I don't know. I mean, obviously when you're in transition,
Mm-hmm.
things get strange, the dark is before the dawn or something, but
Mm-hmm.
I do think that it's probably all part of the same thing, but at least people need to start listening, because maybe somebody has a good idea that you haven't heard before.
I know, how radical. Yeah.
Don't just assume you know what they're going to say.
Right. No, exactly. I think it's not a helpful sign for society when we can no longer offer just human dignity and respect to all voices, right? And so I think, yes, to me, the cancel culture also really bothers me because it's a very it feels degrading to other people, right?
Mhm.
Instead of honoring their true essence. You're right. It's not about agreeing with everyone. Of course, we'll have a million different perspectives on the planet. That's what makes it interesting, potentially interesting. But it's more about, can we honor and give space for and have a more collaborative society where everyone is heard, right? To me, that feels much more of the part of the healing that the feminine can bring.
Yeah, I think it's the last vestiges of control, is just to say, you can't say that, or I'm not listening to you, or whatever. So
Yeah.
so hopefully, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about your book, Doorways to Transformation.
Mm-hmm.
As I said, I haven't finished it, but I love the way it's written, in that each chapter has then questions or things that you can do, so that you can kind of evoke something from the reader, or they can have the experience. So maybe talk a little bit more about that, or how you wrote it, or what inspired you to write it. Was this your process?
Yeah, I intentionally wanted it to be short little chapters and they have, as you mentioned, reflection questions or journal prompts at the end. Partly because, for two reasons. One, that's how I take in information. I tend to take in small quantities of information and then think more deeply. That's just how I process life. So, of course, I wrote the book. It reflects how I am. But I also feel like it fits maybe where we're at as a society. People don't have the capacity to take in large amounts of, we're on information overload as it is. So I thought, okay, well, this makes it easier to digest. You just have a small little digestible chapters, one by one, on different topics, and you can just pick one. And they're only a couple pages long at most. And that's easy for people in the day and age we live in. No one's going to sit down and read a 600 page, well, maybe someone will, but probably not.
We won't. Yeah.
That's right. I won't be. So, and yeah, it's really, you mentioned, I think maybe in the introduction, I've studied kind of contemplative spirituality for a long time, which is really more like, I would say, a mystical spiritual path that involves a lot of time in meditating and nature and listening really to the natural world. That's probably my main place to connect to the divine. And so this book was kind of a reflection of that, where I might be taking a walk or visiting the botanic gardens, and then just have an insight of an idea, like a seed on a certain topic that could then become a chapter. So, abundance or gratitude, these are some of the chapters, or finding your inner voice. There's kind of a wide range of topics. But I really wanted it to be a book of reflection that would hopefully elicit maybe a deeper shift for someone, that might lead to a new aha or a new place of freedom in their life. And it's kind of a marriage of both meditations on encouraging the creative process, as well as reflections from my cross-cultural experience living in Mexico. So I kind of interweave those snippets throughout. So it's kind of an eclectic book in that way.
Well, and I think it goes back also. I mean, I think hopefully the way we are educated begins to change. Whereas in the past, it was about, ramming information down someone's throat, and then they had to regurgitate it on the test. And and if you did, and you did that well, that meant, that you were going to get a good grade. You probably didn't learn anything, because you just memorized whatever it was in order to repeat it back. And I do think this is more like the Socratic method, where you're asking the individual, you're giving them here's why I'm asking the question, but then you give the question. And I think that makes the book very interactive and that's important.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and I love that the chapters are short because I'm one of those people. Like
Right, right.
I can't, I can't.
Yeah.
And being a writer, I mean, I feel I'm more a storyteller than a writer. I
Mm-hmm.
probably don't have good writing form, but I can't do that. Like I can't keep repeating what I said
Mm-hmm.
in a slightly different way so
Mm-hmm.
that there's no confusion about what I meant about what I said. And that's what I feel with so many books that are, and yeah, they're explaining whatever it is really well because they
Mm-hmm.
go over and over and over it again. But how much, what do we really get out of that? Like
Mm-hmm.
even when somebody says something, what do we hear from that? You ask three different people and they probably got three different ideas. So I don't think that over verbalizing or being so
Mm-hmm.
precise with something actually helps. As you said, it
Mm-hmm.
loses they get bored or
Yeah.
they just get lost in the words somehow.
Yeah, no, that's actually a really good point. And even what you're saying about how people learn or maybe don't learn, but in terms of the educational system with things being kind of rammed down your throat, I feel like, and this connects back to the divine feminine, a key piece of the divine feminine and also this way of learning really, I think, relates to inner authority. So, for example, like with this book, it's in these short, digestible chapters that are kind of suggestive. And my intent is to then hand back, the authority, if you will, to the reader and to be like, okay, what does this mean for you? Or what is your impression? And I think that's how we learn best is when we're empowered, right?
Yes.
Come into our own knowing, our own interpretation, our own sense of just intuitive knowing. And I think a lot of, you make an interesting point about the educational system. A lot of it, well, it's a top-down authority structure. So it's how well can you digest and memorize the external authority that we're presenting to you in whatever subject matter.
Indoctrination. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Versus communicating in a different way where you can still present ideas, but then hand back the authority to the reader or to the recipient and let them draw their own conclusions. I think that's
But
really
sadly, the other system doesn't ever teach you how to think.
Oh,
And that's which again, if it's indoctrination,
yeah,
okay, you don't want anybody to think. But
right.
I see people
Hmm.
like, going through school
Mm-hmm.
and they don't know how to form a thought and
Mm-hmm.
they don't know how to have an opinion. Again, maybe that's the whole point. But I think that was the point with Socrates was he believed that you already had it all inside of you. You just had to find it. And if somebody asks you the question, then you will go in and you will try to find it. And I think that that's true. I think most of us, and again, that's probably a big part of the feminine is that ability to access information. This is, for me, one of the things I get from teaching is that when a student asks me a question, maybe I don't know the answer, but then I can access the answer. And very often a student will ask me a question and I answer it, and I've never heard that information before because it just, it just sort of comes through. But
Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought to ask myself that question because I didn't see it. I couldn't I couldn't formulate the question just because it wasn't somehow on my radar to begin with. But then when someone does ask the question, it's like, oh wow, yes, that's a new perspective. That's an interesting point. And I really do think we as individuals have a lot more access to information. And theoretically, we probably have access to all the information around us if we just knew how to access it.
Yes, and I feel like that is a skill that's gone missing in our kind of however thousands of years of however long indoctrination, right? Through all the systems, the education, religion, and all of that. But I feel like to me, that's been a fascinating part of the resurgence of the divine feminine, is learning, and I've had my own personal journey with this, how to tap into what you just shared, how you hadn't heard that question, but all of a sudden this answer came out of you that you didn't even know you had. Kind of like being a channel. That's what I equate it with. And for me, the creative process, and also whether it's art or writing or, dance or all these creative forms, it's really at the core about being a channel or being a conduit for something beyond yourself, or that is within you, but it's not maybe in your conscious awareness. I think for me, that's been the most fascinating part of the creative process for me, is when that happens in my life, when it's like, oh, I wrote something. I'm like, oh, wow, where did that come from? Or if I, make a collage and then I see all this symbolism that I wasn't consciously intending. And I'm like, oh, it's like it's speaking to me. It's like these things we are a conduit for have a life force of their own. And it is what we carry within us. Anyway, that for me, that's a fascinating dimension. And I can feel like I have so much more. There's so much more room for me to really grow and deepen into that, because I think the other conditioning is so strong, the indoctrination type of conditioning. It's so strong. And so there's a lot of deprogramming to do. But yeah, it's learning another way of knowing. And it's exciting. And it is empowering, because it is like inside of us. Like, wow, we have so much more power than we realize, or than we've been told. Yeah.
Yes, some brilliant person, but I don't know who it was, said that art is a doorway to the divine. And I think that that's very true, because when you're in that mental state of creating, I think it is a receptivity. You're moving by inspiration, whether you know it or not. And it is a doorway for the divine, that you open yourself up, and then things can come through you that maybe it's even just a state of being. Maybe creativity is just a state of being, of that surrendered state, or that ability to be acted upon by something greater than you, or to surrender to the process. And I think that that artists have that ability. Well, why would anybody else have that ability? I mean, it's sort of been beaten out of us. So if you did have it, you shut it down, because that wasn't something that was valued. I'm sure children have that. They just start dancing or drawing, or, even on the walls, or places
right.
they shouldn't. But,
Yeah.
but, it's probably a compulsion for them to allow whatever that is that's inside of them to come through them. And, then they're shut down, because no, that's not what you're supposed to do, or you're not allowed to do that, or whatever. So, yeah, I think art and spirituality are deeply connected. And again, probably because they are aspects of the divine feminine, that receptive state, as opposed to that more closed or controlling state.
Right. Yeah, I feel like the controlled closing state is what creates blocks for us, right? So when I think about my own creative process, when I'm getting stuck, quote unquote, it's usually because like that kind of like, making forward movement happen has stopped working. And so I think it's a good reminder for me when I'm stuck, or like I don't know how to proceed with this creative work, to really put myself in a place of just receptivity, right? To go do an activity, or for me, it's always nature, but a setting where I can just be without an external agenda and just listen. I think it's when the external agenda gets overvalued that we either get stuck, or we resort to using force, which is also part of the patriarchy, I think. Forcing an agenda to happen, as opposed to being a collaborative partner. And collaboration and being a partner involves listening, and like you said, receiving, and all these qualities that bring balance. And so, yeah, it's just so interesting to be aware of that, even within your own self and what you're creating, and how to return to a posture of openness. Because it does, as you say, it does require surrender. And when we're open, we have to release maybe how we think something should look, or a logical fact that we don't want to overlook, or, something that seems like this makes sense that it should go this way. You have to be willing to release all of that and, enter into places that seem mysterious or unknown or undefined. And so, yeah, surrender's a good word, a good partner for being open.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How do you feel that your artwork, your artwork has changed since you went to Mexico? Are you doing more of something than you did before, or the quality of it changes, or?
I have actually in the past year started making a new series of collages. So in my art career, that's how I began, was with collage. And then I moved into other art forms and some of the public art projects I mentioned. But my Mexico journey has actually involved 2 different locations. The first was San Miguel de Allende, which is a small town. And now I'm in Mexico City. So it's been interesting. In my time in Mexico City is when my art expression has really opened up again in a new way with these small collages, which aren't really, that particular medium isn't new to me, but the kinds of collages coming out feel a bit different to me. And it's interesting because I'm in the midst of writing a book on the divine feminine and a spiritual path. And I feel like this art making, it's interesting that it's resurfacing now, because I think it's meant to be an integral part of this book that I'm writing. Not so much that I'm going to actually include literal images of the art in the book. That's not what I'm thinking. It's more like the creative energy, the process of making the art is feeding what I'm meant to write in the book. I very much feel that. So it's been interesting just to observe and allow, back to allowing. Like, I don't understand fully why this impetus and why they've kind of rebirthed the collages, but they have. And I do think when I'm in the midst of creating them, it helps me get into a certain open flow space. And I think that energy is then very useful to bring to the writing for this particular topic of the divine feminine, that I think I meant to write from that energy. So, yeah, so that's been probably the most recent kind of expression, creative expression with art that's been coming out of me here in Mexico.
Well, I think the artwork creates the doorway. For me, it was dance. The book that I downloaded it all while I was dancing, because it put me in that right state of being. So I think that could be the same thing for you. You do the collage, and that puts you into whatever that frequency is that you need to be in to be receptive. That's what gets you there. That's what opens the channel, or however you want to describe it.
Yeah, exactly. It's a portal, if you will, to the right space, energetic and spiritual space from which then to express writing. Because I don't know what your experience with writing is. I know for me, my best writing happens when it's also kind of a place of being like a channel where something is coming through me. But because it's a bit more of an analytical medium, it can be easy for me to get into the analytical side, which has its place. When you're editing a book or things like that, there's times where you need to bring in a more analytical perspective. But prior to those stages, when I'm just in the creating stage of writing, it's best if I can just stay in this kind of receptivity, expressing channel mode. But that can be challenging for me, just because of the nature of writing. I can sometimes drop into overthinking, and then that kind of turns on an unhelpful side of my brain. Yeah.
Yes, I can relate to that. And I feel like if I write something that I hear these writers say, well, you have to just do it. You have to get up every morning. You have to do it. Yeah, I can do that, but it's going to be crap. Like what I write is going to, mine is the other. It's like the opening comes and it all just comes in, and I'm just the scribe. I guess that's the difference, is I feel I'm more of a scribe than I am of a writer. I'm just collecting the pieces. So maybe it depends. If you were a person that was actually thinking or creating the storyline or whatever to what was happening, then maybe the other process works. And I guess that's the point. Everybody's process is different. So, they should do whatever works for them. How they get there is going to be different for every person, probably.
That's very true. There is no one way. That's why I'm not, it's fun to occasionally take a class or read a book on people that give instruction in these areas. But I'm not a fan for the, this is the way to create or to write, because I just think, that doesn't even make sense. There's a lot of ways to create things in the world. And I think the more freedom people feel, the better and what they create, the better quality of what they create, because it's coming from a free place. You can tell if things become more just a formula, or if it's
No, absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you, Karen. Thank you for being here today and for speaking about these things. This is always interesting for me, and I hope it has been for the audience. Before we go, are there any sort of parting thoughts, any message you'd like to convey to the audience that I didn't ask you about? I'm sure there are many things, but
yeah, well, let's see. I think like the biggest, certainly it's had a lot of value in my life, and that I really love to impart to other people. It's just a confidence in their own knowing. We've mentioned that a couple times throughout our talk, but our intuition and our inner knowing and inner authority. But yeah, just to really affirm people's path, and that, what is best for you, the way to go, how you're meant to express in the world, and to trust that. Because I think a lot of times, we can we get stuck so easily by being hung up on something external to ourselves, opinions or judgments or that kind of thing. But to know that we're designed to live from our place of internal power, and it's there for a reason, and that it's a trustworthy guide. Intuition is a trustworthy guide. So, yeah.
That's a beautiful phrase. Yes. Yeah. Intuition is a trustworthy guide.
Yeah.
Remember that, because I think that's really true. And because we're all so different, that's going to be how you get to your place. Well, thank you. So if people want to get in touch with you, you have a website?
Yeah, I have a website. It's my name, KarenKinney.com. And then on the website, you can find links to social media, like Instagram, if you like that, or email.
I think you have a journal as well, right? That you can sign up for on the website.
Oh, yeah, a newsletter.
Quarterly journal.
That's right. Yeah, I do. I send out, that's on, if you go to there's a Divine Feminine page on my website. And if you look there, I send out a quarterly newsletter that's kind of a curation of women's voices around the Divine Feminine. So it includes interviews with women about their spiritual journey, art, poetry from writers, some of my own writing, but it's all about the Divine Feminine and her rise on the planet. So that's
beautiful.
Find that there.
Yes.
Thank you.
And you're on Instagram, Karen_E_Kinney, and Facebook as Karen.Kinney.4. So you can find Karen many places. So
that's right. Yes, many options in today's world.
Yes, and your books. So Karen has a lot to offer you. So please follow up on those things. All right. Well, thank you for being here. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. It's really been fun. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And thank you to the viewers for being here, for listening. And I hope you will follow up, check out Karen's website. And if you want to find me, theuniversaldancer.com is my website, and also my classroom. I do have courses there on sacred dance and other things. So check that out as well. And thank you for being here. And I hope you will join us again next month. All right. Bye-bye.